Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here as we begin this panel on open climate. I would like to speak to you a little bit about the work that we have been doing this year, which has been to start exploring the relation between the open movement and climate action. And this group of panelists that you see here has been grappling with this question. And for that, we have been hosting a series of calls during 2021 with different experts from academia, activists, technologists from different places to discuss how open technologies can help us to collectively respond to climate change and support environmental activism. And for this session, I would like to mention a couple things. First, that we'll be doing a round-robin interview style, which means that each of the panel members will be interviewing another and asking ourselves questions that have to do with the open movement, with climate change, and about what is the relationship between both, how they can work together, and what is the relevancy in this time of knowledge and in general for impact in our society. So to begin, I would like to start interviewing EVELIN HEIDEL, SCANN. So if you may, please, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm very excited about being in this panel. And about myself, I've been a long-time member of the open movement, so to speak, being related to Wikipedia, Creative Commons, and in general, like the broader digital rights movement. Yeah, and that's it.
Awesome. All right, so I have a few questions for you, and I'll begin with this. Climate movement activists and advocates are re-examining their power relations and grappling with historical exclusions of people because of race, gender, class, or geographic origin. This call for change is also happening in the open movement, which advocates for liberating access to the historical body of intellectual resources such as art, literature, research, and other expressions that we call the knowledge commons. In short, we believe that knowledge must be shared in order for humanity to survive and thrive, and that is essential to help fight climate change. So how do we get there?
That's a good question, and I don't know if I have an answer for that necessarily, but I do think that there are like several places where we could start, and one of the places that we can start from is actually trying to create communities that are interested in exploring those intersections. I think that's part of the initial idea that sparked this open climate conversations, the need to gather around a community that sort of makes sense and sees the larger picture of what's happening with our knowledge commons in relationship with climate change. We know that there are some people doing something there in Wikipedia. We know that there are some people like doing some open environmental data, for example, or open data more in general. We know that there's people doing open science around climate change, but there's still not a common narrative or something that brings us all together. And I think that's an important part of like, how do we get it from here, from everyone like doing their own thing here to something that we can all collaboratively work on that helps bring this knowledge commons together. And in the process, something that we are finding is more and more important, have fun. How do we also have fun while we try to convene these communities in working together in solving this problem?
Great. Now, next question. A scan of the open movement, which comprises networks, projects, and organizations that advocate for the creation, curation, and sharing of the knowledge commons through the use of open licenses, shows very limited collaboration with people who are fighting climate change. But when you look at them, these movements have very similar values, and their activists envision similar horizons of human and planetary well-being, yet actions are being organized and conducted separately. Can you reflect on how you might imagine future generations of open activists using the digital commons to grapple with climate change, which is one of the greatest challenges of humanity?
Yeah, well, I think that there are like several issues in a way with like how we conceive digital commons. And I think this is something that it was very powerful with one of our speakers that we always love to quote her because she made a great point, Ana Grijalva from the UNDP Accelerator Labs, where she was talking about the smallest possible policymaker, right? And you know that smallest possible policymaker could be a farmer that is actually in the front line of, you know, helping fight deforestation, but it's not necessarily like your data geek or nerd that, you know, is like gathering around all like satellite images and putting them together. And so I think that one of the biggest challenge that we have with like this future generation sort of thinking is like, how do we make knowledge more accessible, not only in terms of like the legal infrastructure around it, so like Creative Commons licenses or like open software licenses and such, but also how do we make it more accessible for the people that actually need that knowledge in order to fight climate change or whatever other challenge that they might be having on the ground. So for example, with Wikipedia, we see this a lot. It's like, it's very important that we have this information on the encyclopedia, but then is this information something that people can actually, you know, reuse in their own context or even understand in their own context? And I think that's where the legal infrastructure might help with making this knowledge more legally accessible, but then we need to keep on working with communities to actually understand how they can reuse and benefit from this digital open commons that it's out there.
Thanks. And finally, why open climate and why now?
Is there anything more important to be working on? That's my main question, right? I think that like this is a very important societal issue that we all should be working on. And I think that the climate movement in general has been working with open tactics, even when they don't necessarily identify them as such. And so it's important that we try to work together on seeing how open can actually aid and help in solving some of the challenges, and what are the things that we can learn from the climate movement, and also find roles to work in this, like more, you know, all hands on deck, everyone like trying to solve this problem.
All right, thanks. Now your turn.
Yes, now it's my turn to interview Luis Felipe. Please, Luis Felipe, would you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Luis Felipe. I am a researcher. I'm currently working for the Center for the University of Virginia School of Data Science, the Center for Data Ethics and Justice. And I've been working on questions of data sharing, software sharing, hardware sharing from an anthropological perspective. And I've been, more recently, I've been working as well, like in a big collaboration in the North Slope of Alaska, in Nupia territory, on questions of environmental data sharing.
Great. And so I'll go ahead and ask you some questions. And some of the extracts that we're using were actually published in our Open Climate Now branch article that we published recently in Branch Magazine. And so I'll start with the first question. So the environmental movement identified the depletion of planetary resources as a threat to our livelihood, the tragedy of the anti-commons. With this concern came an interrogation of technological progress as a flagship for the betterment of humanity. We have come to understand that the main tragedy is not the self-interest depletion of common resources, but a lack of shared understanding of our planetary health that involves the commons across the informational, ecological, political, and educational spheres. The story of the commons has not been one about movements working together towards the same goal, but rather about movements witnessing the same tragedy happening in different spaces. Luis Felipe, how do we not duplicate this tragedy of the anti-commons from occurring in the space of open climate? What are your thoughts on this?
I think one of the important points we made in that piece, it's provides a really good answer to the question you're asking. So basically, we said as a collective in that piece that the tragedy that we saw is it's not the tragedy of the commons as an impossibility, which economic theory posits that basically you have self-interest, egotistic agents who are basically going to deplete all the natural resources if you have a commons-based regime, right? So this argument has been debunked. You know, Ostrom is like a person who did empirical research for her group and debunked that. And we also have several a tradition of research on commons-based peer production that also helped to advance the critique of this of the tragedy of the commons. So what we said in the piece that I think it's really important is that the tragedy is actually the anti-commons, in the sense that we have an economic machinery, a logic, an economic logic, and a set of economic practices that basically everything that it touches becomes property. So in the sense, you have something that moves ahead and penetrates every aspect of life, and then it is an anti-commons machinery, right? So now, when it comes to the question of the environment, the question of climate change, we put something forward as a collective that I think it's really important to emphasize, is this idea that openness is an actual practice. More than just a value or a symbol. It is a practice that leads to several other practices with very important implications for the struggle that we have in fighting climate change. And to make this more concrete, the basic idea is that if you see the machinery of the anti-commons moving ahead and penetrating into several aspects of life, we also see that happening in the domain of sciences and environmental sciences, right? So since the 1980s, we have seen an increased commercialization of the sciences. So the sciences has also been touched by the anti-commons, the machinery of the anti-commons, right? So basically, when we say as a collective in the open climate that openness is a practice, we're basically saying that this is an antidote to the anti-commons machinery that is advancing in the sciences. And by practicing openness, we might be able to create an open climate collective of a bigger dimension that will foster commons for environmental data and for practices that are important for advancing the struggle against climate change. So this is a very complicated, convoluted answer to basically to be very straightforward. So openness is a practice, and it helps us actually address the problem of the tragedy of the commons with respect to the environmental sciences.
Great. No, but I love this answer. Moving forward, during the June Open Climate Call, you brought two unique perspectives to the space to interrogate the framework of openness applied to social science research of the climate crisis. Can you tell us about your work on translating the open movement into environmental research of the climate crisis? Where are we succeeding and where are we stumbling?
Okay, so again, I think it's important to recap some of the work that we did as a collective to answer this question. So in our call number 3, if people go to the wiki of Open Climate and access the video, we had a debate with 2 colleagues from Brazil, working in Brazil, Maiana Lassen and Silvio Carlos, who have been working on research and also working with open environmental data. And we discussed this idea that there is a debate in Brazil surrounding the notion of the social environmental perspective. And the basic idea is that when the debates about sustainability started to happen in Brazil and gather momentum, the basic idea was that you could not address environmental questions without addressing social questions as part of the environmental question. And that perspective became very powerful. So this is one of the key influences, one of the key sources of influence to actually translate the work that we do in the open space with the open communities to the environmental space. The second thread that I think is really important in terms of an influence that helps us do this translation as well, and again, it's not my work, I'm contributing into a space where several people are working on, it's the idea of the ecological paradigm in anthropology. And this is specific to anthropology, but we can extrapolate. And there's several anthropologists and social scientists working on this. We have Isabel Carvalho, we have Carlos Style, Tim Ingold, we have Otávio Velho, and several others. And the basic idea is that with the ecological paradigm is that historically, we have been separating two domains of practice and research and basically study. The domain of the environment and nature, and the domain of the social matters, the political matters, the cultural matters. And they have been have been kept very well separated to the point there's tension when you try to bring the two together. So in order to translate what we do in the open movement to the environmental sciences and environmental activism, we actually need to adopt the perspective of the ecological paradigm to not operate in this this distinction between environmental and the social, right? Between the nature and society. If we manage to bring these together, the study of these two domains and the activist practice in these two domains, we will be able to advance and make open climate as a political and a technological practice happen. So I see these two, to make this long conversation very short, I see these two major influences as key influences for helping us make this translation. The social environmental perspective, which is the social movements in Brazil, working with this perspective, and the ecological paradigm, which is something that is happening in the social sciences that can inform our work.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And it really connects with this idea of openness as a practice. And so last question, which is going to be the same repeated question. For you, why open climate and why now?
I think you gave the best answer. You know? So basically, I mean, it's not a matter of choice. It's not something that we get to decide. I mean, each one of us needs to be working on this from different angles and different perspectives in different spaces. And the urgency is here with us, and we don't have a choice. We need to be working on these questions. Even if we think we're very far from these questions, like in our work, we should be finding ways to actually bring the question of climate change to our daily practices. So I think that's how I would answer to the question.
Great, thank you so much, Luis Felipe. And now over to you to interview Michelle Thorne.
Okay, so Michelle, in the piece that we wrote for Branch Magazine, we had the following quote that I'm going to read. So open quote. Openness can be part of the response to transforming the structural upholding of power through centering how we think about information sharing and dissemination through a lens of epistemic justice. If we're to bring our movements close together, we ought to do it in what ought we do in our everyday practices. We need to talk, listen, share, and connect around the theme of the commons, which is destroyed by the corporate anti-commons, the primate object of climate action, and that of the digital monopolies, the primate object of dispute in the context of the open movement, close quote. How do you do this in your work towards a sustainable future for the internet?
Yeah, thank you so much for this great question about the commons. And the commons is such a powerful concept, and I think really key to linking the open movement and the climate movement, which, as you've said, are about physical and knowledge commons. And I see the internet as being a really important tool to facilitate that. And the internet itself is built on open standards and open protocols, and those are tended to in a commons-like way. And one of the challenges we see is the further privatization and consolidation, centralization of powers on the internet, similarly to how we're seeing that in the in the physical and knowledge commons. And so I think the practices of openness can help us both make visible how that power consolidation is happening and to challenge it and use openness to actually to shift some of that power. And I think when I think about the sustainable internet, it's about having an internet that is in service to these commonses and to people's like participation. And I think one of the kind of underexplored areas, especially in the sustainable internet space, is what's the relationship of the internet to the land, to the water, to the local communities where that internet infrastructure is running. And I think this is something that we need to pay more attention to and have better relationships around.
Okay, so here's another question for you. The August Open Climate Call focused on how we can create a fossil fuel free internet by 2030. Why is this framework so important in the context of open climate? What's one recommendation for how we achieve this goal?
Oh, that's a great question around, how focusing on a fossil-free internet and what is one thing we could do to get there. I think one really important step is first just recognizing that the internet is the world's largest coal-powered machine. And we actually need to not think of the internet as, as ephemeral or intangible, and really understand that it's grounded in the use of materials and resources and labor, and it is manifested in places. And by seeing that, I think then we start to be able to see, okay, well, what needs to change to shift it away from being powered by fossil fuels and away from extractive relationships. And so I think focusing on that is really helpful, because the open internet is one of the things that I think that has really helped enable and spur on the open movement. And if we want this kind of global knowledge commons, the internet is going to be one of the best resources, tools we have to achieve that. And we want that tool to be a sustainable tool, therefore a fossil-free one. So I think for me, these issues are all interrelated. We need the open movement and the climate movement working together, and we need the internet as a fossil-free, open tool in service of those goals.
Okay, so here's our last question for you. For you personally, why open climate and why now?
The climate crisis, it's here, it's now, it's affecting us unequally. And I think we have both a responsibility to step up, to do something about it. And it's going to be something that just affects like every aspect of life for the coming decades. And the open movement, I think, has really a lot of potential to step up what a climate response looks like. And as I was saying earlier, the openness has a real capacity to make transparent where power relations are, and also to push and change those. And so I think that this is a huge opportunity to step up to this, planetary crisis. So Alex, I have a few questions for you. So the communities in critical need of knowledge about the climate crisis, they need information in languages that the commercial internet is never going to prioritize. But fortunately, those languages are being supported by free and open source projects like Wikipedia and OpenStreetMap. You've mentioned you've collaborated with 230 million Bangla speakers who live in some of the most at-risk spaces in the world for sea level rise, or working with like the aging 30% of the population in the Philippines, working in agriculture areas that are also sensitive to sea level rise. How are you thinking about centering multiple language systems and knowledge systems in the work of Open Climate?
I think it starts with a place where the Wikimedia community is, which is the community I work with, right, which supports over 300 languages on Wikipedia and organizes all around the world in those local language contexts, but also in these more international and cultural exchange languages that have kind of taken over. And it's really important to think about, like, who are the leaders who can kind of enable the collection of the knowledge in that language, and can they kind of connect with the right people, the right knowledge holders, and the right kind of formats for sharing knowledge that are appropriate for every context, right? So say in the Philippines, they may not need an encyclopedia article. They may need like a visual story on how to adapt agricultural practices into their own kind of form of agriculture or form of context, right? And I think we see this best in the Wikimedia community with what we call movement organizers. These are open advocates who also care about these topics for action, like climate or sustainability or adaptation, right? And they when kind of exposed and given the space and given kind of invitation to organize community and to reach like local climate activist communities, local groups of experts, retirees who have time on their hands, but plenty of, need for things to do, right? When invited to organize those folks, they do fill the gaps that are most relevant in that context, but they need information, they need context, they need support, they need access to organizations like the UN, like activist groups who may be very focused on other things. And so for me, in like campaigns we organize like Wiki for Human Rights, it's really important about just creating the platform that invites those organizers, gives them the space to explore what's right for their community, right? And kind of provides that extra layer of support that they may not have if they were to go off and organize on their own. And I think kind of expanding that out beyond Wikimedia, I think if we build Open Climate, it needs to be about inviting people who are already leaderful, like they already are in the space in their communities, that they can do the right thing for them in the face of the climate crisis. But as they kind of get exposed to our network, they maybe think of new ideas, see new connections, find new practices, and better understand where openness fits for their work. And so kind of thinking, who are the leaderful people and what do they not see from us, and how can we listen better to them to make sure that we're creating the space they need, whatever it might be.
Another question for you. So intellectual property, it has serious limitations in terms of accessibility and adaptability to this fast changing and increasingly unequal world. And many climate activists think of the COVID-19 pandemic as a kind of dress rehearsal for at least the next 3 decades of society adapting to climate change's impacts. The countries that are benefiting the most from intellectual property monopolies are not the ones that are going to need the most rapid deployment of new technologies to adapt to climate change or the biodiversity crisis. Could you talk a little bit about your work with Wikimedia and how you're addressing IP monopolies, and why does it matter to the open climate conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think Wikimedia is kind of fortunate in that we're a top 10 website, and so we can kind of throw our weight behind open content, things that are openly licensed. And what we learned so before I worked on kind of general activist outreach, I worked with cultural heritage institutions. And what we learned really early on was that like these institutions think they're sharing, but because of the way they interact with these intellectual property limitations, or the way they publish things, or how it's published in terms of accessibility or findability or multilinguality, they're creating barriers that they didn't know about, right? And Wikimedia is like a good tool, kind of a carrot, like, oh, you can connect to this really big website if you open up the intellectual property. And so a good example of this is we worked with WHO early in the COVID pandemic to help them release content. And what we found is just the few infographics that they shared with us and other institutions shared with us kind of found their way into many more languages than those institutions would ever be able to support, right? And I think when we kind of step back about climate change, like weather data is very hard to interpret and use on the ground, right? The IPCC reports are copyrighted. Why? Who knows? Like, what are they protecting against? And these kinds of things where it's like, no, if you want the best science, the best knowledge in the hands of people on the ground in their language, you gotta open it up, right? And that's kind of where like you have Wikipedia as a partner, but I think from a more practical level, and this is where we're all going to be quoting the lowest possible decision maker quote from that wonderful presentation we had. You also need to find ways to like make things break apart and be accessible, and that's really not the domain of scientists, right? Like scientists are not trained that way per se, and all of the incentives right now are to like just publish the thing and move on to the next research. And I think there's a need for a whole group of facilitators and access to that knowledge, like to translate what has been published by experts and turn it into actual usable things. And you know, Wikipedia, OpenStreetMap, the kind of work you're doing, Shannon, that Shannon, who's the next person that's talking, is doing, the kind of work that you're doing, Michelle, all these kind of fit in to the conversation.
And for you, Alex, why open climate and why now?
This crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the pollution crisis, they're paralyzing, right? They are like, there's so much pressure. This is, as the UN has been emphasizing, the like code red for humanity. And we need to be able to empower people to do something, right? To participate. And I think if we think about things like Wikipedia, if we think about open knowledge, open data, citizen science, all these things are things you can do while you're weathering the crisis. And the prerequisite for that is openness, right? You need to be able to be invited to participate in the action, right? And I think, you know, I hear a lot of climate activists use the rhetorical thing like individual action's not enough. We also need, we need you to just go do political action and create systems change. Well, the systems change needs a body of evidence that is accessible and reusable and participatory in order for like the systems to change too. And I think that's where like open climate's kind of a nice, happy, it's like an individual action that's also part of the infrastructure for change, which I think is where we need to be thinking.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to be interviewing Shannon, who's been a fearless leader and building some of our space for the open climate calls. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself, Shannon?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Shannon DOSEMAGEN, and I use the pronouns she, her. I'm really excited to be speaking with this wonderful group of people today. I am currently a fellow with the Shuttleworth Foundation and leading a project called the Open Environmental Data Project. I also interact with many different communities, including the Open Climate community and the Gathering for Open Science Hardware. The work that I do is deeply grounded in community science, thinking about the application of open technologies to issues of industrial pollution and environmental justice. I previously worked with Public Lab for a decade, which really grounded some of my thinking in this space.
So we both come from kind of parts of the open movement that had really early foundations in this concept of freedom. And in our essay, we talk about, you know, we ask, is freedom the true core value in free and open source communities? Or do we need to transform and rebuild openness in a new way that makes sense for community initiatives that are dedicated to affecting social change? Community projects seek justice across a whole spectrum of critical issues, including climate change, food security, housing rights, migration, but also in reimagining open community practices around issues like Indigenous culture to reclaim an open internet for all. Can you talk a little bit about the context, especially in your own work, but more generally too, of this kind of balancing of justice and environmental and climate data, and why is it critical for us to do this rethinking of the concept of freedom as we think about the climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. And I've been reflecting a lot on the trajectory of my own work and how I've found myself in the open space. And so maybe I will frame my answer in that way. And I go back to now, I think almost 15 years ago, when I was working with a small organization that supported fence line communities, or communities that sit adjacent to large oil and gas refining facilities in Louisiana. And the premise of the organization was to help them to gather information and data so that they could advocate on behalf of community priorities. One of the tools that the Louisiana Bucket Brigade used was an actual bucket that was modeled on a US Environmental Protection Agency SUMA canister. So it was an air monitoring device that would allow people to do grab samples of air quality when the local Department of Environmental Quality or regional EPA couldn't come out to do monitoring. And I say all this because at the time, the bucket was not open sourced, but what was wrapped around the use of the bucket was so very in line with how we think about open source that we focused on transparency and sharing of data. We thought about creating collaborative spaces. We were doing community building and community organizing, and kind of more the traditional manner of the word. So the premise was very much aligned with open culture and the way that open communities do work, but the word open wasn't necessarily inserted into it. And so I think about how my work evolved with Public Lab and the work that I've done supporting communities that are addressing issues of environmental injustice, and that really is the premise is, can we take the underpinnings of open, so collaboration, community building, and start there rather than thinking about the insertion of or centering of licenses and certifications and other forms of technical mechanisms around open, to start thinking differently about what openness and open culture and the open movement can mean for social and environmental injustices.
That's great, and I think it's always very hard to push away from the technical and think about the practice, and I think that connects a lot to what FELIPE was talking about earlier too. From our pilot series of open climate calls, we learned, and this is a quote, "Open climate collaborations need an end-user oriented approach to reaching other publics, which are not the ones we find in the open movement. The open movement tends to favor the makers, software developers, and content producers. However, these projects don't have a good understanding of the diversity of our movement and how this approach can engage multiple constituencies in climate action. How do we shift to see other users of the results of the open climate space?"
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking a lot about this in my own work now. So in working with the Open Environmental Data Project, the kind of premise I entered in on was that rather than our environmental data workflows being pipelines where data from communities moves to policymakers, or data from government can move to communities and other researchers in straightforward ways, we have these environmental mazes, so complex systems that do not necessarily replicate, which makes it really, really difficult for us to interact in them. And yet we have done an enormous amount of work in the environmental space over the last decade of opening up data sets. And so I'm really interested in, when we talk about the application of the open movement, and the kind of technicalities of openness into the environmental space or into the climate action and justice space, what does this actually mean now? And are we, should we be putting openness in service to our work, in service to the problems that we want to solve, rather than, using the kind of technicalities of openness as a framework to say the open movement has come to solve these problems. I think if we're going to make really clear connections between the work of environmental justice and climate action, and then the open movement, we have to create new and different spaces or shift ones that exist to show that the work that needs to be done can happen in many different places and at many different points of workflows. So, in my own work on environmental data, there certainly are a significant number of inroads for software developers, makers to become involved, but then also thinking about, people who are potentially sitting in tech companies who can do service to thinking about sustainability in their server rooms, for instance. So I think that's where our shifts are going to come in, is recognizing what open has done already at this point in its history, and then being willing to shift the conversation to thinking about the usability of openness and how we can actually apply it to solving our current problems.
Yeah, I think that's been really similar to our experience in the Wikimedia movement, where both like the macro accessibility and the micro accessibility of like contributing and participating is really, really important to like success, right, of the doing part of the work. And and thinking about all this, like, why now? Why open climate? What's like pulling at you to be in this conversation?
Yeah, I think it's the time and the moment and the space for transformation in both. I want to be just like +1 to what SCANN said at the very beginning. Like, what else should we be doing? Like, this is so important. But also, I think as we wrote about in the Open Climate Now article, we need to do a lot of reflection on where not only the open movement started and came from and, the last decades of its trajectory, but we need to do the same in the environmental movement. There's a lot of problematic histories that we both have to reckon with and reconcile and then, change from. So I think open climate for me is a space, it's a time, it's a place that we can spend thinking about how we do that transformative work. Even in the last 5-6 calls that we've done so far, just seeing who comes, the perspectives that they bring, the kind of vast differences, but also these binding similarities has really been heartening. And I think that this is just for me, a hopeful community for how we address such an urgent problem with kind of proactive thoughtfulness.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks.
All right. And going back to our very first speaker who gave us the welcome, I'm really pleased to do a short conversation with Emilio. Emilio, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, my name is Emilio Vélez. I am the executive director of the Apropedia Foundation. I have worked in the past decade in international development here in El Salvador, where I live. And alongside that line of work, I've also done lots of projects and initiatives related to open hardware and innovation. So I try to put both together, and now I'm focusing more on appropriate technology.
All right, thank you. So several of our panelists have mentioned the question that I'm going to ask, because I think it was one of the most impactful conversations that we had over the course of the Open Climate calls. So a guest that you invited to the April 2021 conversation that you led, Emilio, Ana Grijalva from UNDP Accelerator Lab Ecuador, said something that struck us as central to an effective open climate solution. All of the outputs of open climate need to be relevant to the smallest possible policymaker and participant, not just big institutions. The smallest policymaker may mean a farmer who doesn't speak a dominant language, but controls acres of forest needed for maintaining our global carbon balance, a local but supportive politician who has never seen the messy side of data wrangling, or a youth activist who won't become an intellectual property wonk. We don't want to repeat the mistake of the earlier environmental movement and the work of international development of doing policy and creating half-conceived solutions without those most at risk for being affected by climate change, rather than building with them. Emilio, how do we ensure this in the work of Open Climate?
I think it's important to always consider that the impact comes to the smallest level, to our lives, to families, and that is the whole mindset that you see, for example, in, just to give you like a context, in natural disasters. When you speak about natural disasters, it's not a natural disaster if it's not affecting a person, right? It can be a natural event. So when we put people in the center of these discussions, we have to start connecting these common narratives between the policy making and the big decisions and the funding that it's being funneled to specific initiatives, and know where does it go to and why. And I think there's a big disconnect sometimes, especially when you see the north-south relations, because the money comes from the United States, from Europe, and donors sometimes, they travel for 5 days, they visit a community, but it's not the same as understanding the real needs of the communities who are affected by climate change. And these spaces for discussion have to be opened in order to understand the value of data, the value of technology, and also to embrace the contextualization that these solutions embody when they are on the field. Taking the example of Anna, if a rancher is using data to make a decision, we have to start thinking about why they're using this data and in which ways, so that that can scale to bigger and better impactful policies. So I think it's important to bridge through the conversations, and this is one of the things that I really love about Open Climate as a very, for now, very loose movement, trying to bring together different people. And I think we would love to have people who speak different languages. When we were planning on this session, we wanted to have in different languages people, each of us speak from different perspectives. We're all suffering effects of climate change. And we have to start opening up these spaces and bring people who are on the top of the decision-making and the funding and the bottom.
Thank you. So building for these audiences, especially the small policymakers, with an eye for climate justice means that we need to design the whole open stack from hardware to software and content, so data and knowledge, for accessibility, understanding, consent, and active participation. Information security and privacy have been an important value in the free and open source movement, but we often miss key aspects of accessibility for a broad public process of designing and implementing tools. We may have to engage and think critically alongside the communities that have been affected the most by climate to advance an agenda for quote unquote openness that makes sense to people outside the open movement. Can you talk about how you envision designing the whole open stack alongside the smallest policymaker?
There are many ways to address this question. I think that one is to just have this idea in mind, always present, that technology is not neutral, and media technology never neutral. So that means that anything that we bring to the table, that we design, that we try to implement, will have an impact. So that is the first thing, that we have to start having these discussions with everyone to know about the real impacts and about what people want, which is the second one, because tools are not enough, but rather what do people want with the tools and what will they use them for? So I think it's important to have this mindset, this people-centered or community-centered mindset when we're designing any type of technology, that we're using it, so that we can also take into account how this information is being used by people in other places. That we have these discussions in other aspects of the internet, like privacy and misinformation, etc. So having accountable discussions is important, and openness is key for that. So how can we have accountable discussions? It requires open source and other things that can protect the spaces for technology in communities.
All right, and Emilio, final question. So for you, why open climate and why now?
Because I think that we have to protect the knowledge, and we have to embrace all the knowledge. We have to make use of it, but we have to protect it, and we have to make sure that all the voices of different communities are being listened to. And I think that openness is a great way to do it in a way that's accountable.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for listening and for your contributions. I hope that this conversation has been illuminating and has helped show some of the paths we might follow to really foster a planetary commons, one that is really addressing the urgent challenges of today, a changing and warming world, and hopefully together we can make this a more sustainable and just one. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Michelle, for that great closing of our conversation. I think it was lovely to hear from everybody. And what can you do to be part of Open Climate? That's what we're going to try to cover right now. So, of course, the first one is like reach out to climate activists and listen to what they are concerned about. They are often speaking with the values of open, especially the intersectional and inclusive open that we described at the beginning of our essay, Open Climate Now, that you can find in the Branch magazine. Effective outreach starts with learning the language of your future collaborators. So it's important that you connect with climate activists, environmental activists, in order to listen to what they are interested in. Of course, to know more about what Open Climate is doing and what we are doing, you can follow our Appropedia page at appropedia.org/openclimate. And you can also follow us on Twitter. You can follow Alex, Shannon, Emilio, Michelle. Luis Felipe doesn't have Twitter, but you can still follow all of us, and myself included, on Twitter to know more about what we are doing. And you can also start writing about your observations and discussions and connect with us using the hashtag OpenClimate in whatever social media you're using. Help us also, you can also help us by finding projects, thinkers, communities that are already approaching climate from an open perspective. And you can help us by documenting those communities of practice on the Appropedia page. Or if you are interested, you can also help us by writing a longer piece article on our Open Climate Medium publication, which is medium.com/open-climate. And we're also thinking about our season 2 of the Open Climate Calls. So if you're interested in hosting a conversation about openness for climate action in your local community or at upcoming international conferences, you can help us by having that conversation. Or you can also be part of our speaker series. And of course, a reminder that climate action and the open movement work best when local communities explore these issues and then share their experiences with other communities around the world. I think that personally, ourselves as a group have been learning a lot by talking to each other. And this is actually helping us like bring a common narrative. So having these conversations might actually help you in thinking how we can better connect openness with climate action. So thanks again for everyone listening to this conversation, and I hope that you have a great rest of the conference.